A master of interrogation, manipulation, and psychological warfare, Hans Landa was a villain whose pleasant persona makes his evilness all the more disturbing. A good place to start with Hans would be his own self-assessment. Of his own admission, he labels himself a detective, and a damn good one. Director Quentin Tarantino stated that every scene that Hans does is a version of an interrogation or a mind game with the participant. But a subtle one at that, given how polite and civil Hans carries himself throughout his interactions. In rewatching the film, it's plain to see that in almost every scene he's in, Hans is the one poised and relaxed, while his counterpart in the conversation is feeling awkward at best or fearing for their life at worst. One of the tools that Hans weaponizes is the norm of reciprocity, a notion where if someone was polite to you in their actions and speech, then you're more likely to reciprocate with the same level of good manners. By doing so, Hans can keep the interaction civil, which allows his detective skills to shine. It says a lot that despite being a military man with significant firepower on his end, Hans still chooses to extract information via conversation. He already suspected that the fugitives were hiding under the floorboards. He could have simply ordered his men to barge in guns blazing and make quick work of the task, but there would be no satisfaction in that, a satisfaction that Hans can only derive from verbally besting his opponent. Hans is a smaller man of average height at best, and given his high intelligence exemplified by his mastery of 4 languages, it's hardly a surprise that he would prefer to contest in the realm of wits rather than physical brawn. There's only one instance of Hans using physical force in the film, that against Bridget von Hammersmark, and in that instance, we see a tinge of animalistic rage being let loose. But I digress. While Hans may not use much physical force, he does push the envelope in terms of social boundaries to show who's in charge, such as when he rejects the farmer's offer for wine and instead asks for milk. Or when he grabs one of his daughter's hands forcefully as a silent threat. Or when he presumptuously orders milk for Shoshana during their strudel scene, as if to say that she should be content with whatever he deems fit to give her. And in this scene with Lieutenant Aldo, Hans deliberately laughs hysterically in response to hearing Bridget's story about her leg, a silent flex to flaunt that he's seen through their deception to make them uncomfortable. But let's return to the strudel scene for a bit, which brings us to the topic of whether Hans knew of Shoshana's true identity. Here are some of the reasons for and against whether Hans knew or not. First, he ordered milk for her, which could be seen as a jab at her former dairy farm life. Second, the cream on strudel was a test to see if she would reject the dessert. Third, he gave her a long, awkward stare at the end. Fourth, he knew, but kept his mouth shut as he was planning against the SS, or because they were on the decline in the war. As for those against, he never saw her face or her back was against him. There were no photos of her on file, and even her age was unknown before the farmer's revelation. Third, this was all down to Hans, simply giving his usual conversation antics. And fourth, Hans hadn't met Aldo yet or heard of the plan to take down the SS. Based on these, I'm leaning more towards Hans not knowing of Shoshana's identity. The reasons for him knowing can be somewhat explained away, while the reasons against him knowing are more durable. This one's not valid, as cream is only prohibited with meat. The ordering of the milk, as I mentioned earlier, could be just a power play in Hans asserting dominance in their conversation, given that he's head of security, and he's vetting her as a possible host for the Germans. Not to mention, he was dictating that she be the one to operate the projectors and not her assistant. Same goes for the way he stares at her to make her uncomfortable, something which is typical of Hans in other conversations as well. I suppose it's a testament to good writing that it's left ambiguous, but let me know what you think in the comments as we conclude this section. As I mentioned earlier, Hans relishes being the victor in outsmarting his opponent, and nowhere in the film is this clearer than in one of the film's iconic scenes, the one where he pulls out an overly large pipe. It's been said that this moment represents the conclusion of Hans' investigation, sort of like Sherlock Holmes indicating that he's solved the mystery. But on an equal note, this moment highlights a key aspect of Hans, his ego, signifying his inclination to one-up his opponent in a stick-measuring contest. Something like what is happening here with this scene. So he deliberately brought along a pipe just to thump his chest and toot his horn. Being an SS officer, Hans naturally has his hands stained doing their dirty work. but what makes Hans more chilling is his callous conscience. The SS were guilty of many atrocities, some of which were so severe that the soldiers had to desensitize themselves to rationalize their actions. Not so with Hans, who has no qualms causing the deaths of innocents. Beneath the facade of a polite and well-mannered gentleman, Hans conceals a sociopathic and sadistic side to himself, one which we see in his interrogation with the farmer, but ever so slightly reflected in the subtle shifts in his facial expressions, such as the softness in his eyes turning into a cold, piercing stare. This devious side is again displayed when he spares Shoshana. Of course, at this distance, his weapon is out of effective firing range, but then again, Hans has soldiers with jeeps who could have continued the pursuit. Instead, Hans appears elated that Shoshana was getting away, and I believe that his act of sparing Shoshana serves a dual purpose. If finding people is his speciality, then by letting Shoshana go, he is saving himself a target that he can pursue another day, sort of like a hunter, releasing his catch into the wild to hunt it for sport. Also, by sparing Shoshana, Hans gets to indulge in her suffering. She had just lost her family and was penniless, with nothing but the clothes on her back, not to mention being labeled an enemy of the state. If anything, her life would encompass nothing but misery, and Hans can be the one to claim ownership of that fact. But despite his cruel and callous nature, Hans actually has no real allegiance to the forces of evil. His loyalty is always for sale to the highest bidder. As we would expect of someone as manipulative as Hans, he has a penchant for knowing exactly what to say to fit the situation for his benefit. At the start of the film, Hans revels in his reputation as the Jew hunter, but at the end with Lieutenant Aldo, he criticizes the title and tries to distance himself from it in hopes of defecting to the other side. So Hans only joined the SS, as they were the most dominating force at the time, allowing him to have an outlet for expressing his talents. Therefore, it could very well be that if Hans Landa was born in a different country, in a more peaceful era, he might have turned out to be a relatively upright citizen, although not due to any innate moral compass within him. I suppose it's somewhat poetic that Hans defects to the Americans at the end. In his time as an SS colonel, we hear him dehumanizing the Jews as rats. By the end of the film, Hans himself becomes a rat in the sense of a deserter, a nod to the animal's tendency to flee from sinking ships. But despite the permanent mark on his forehead publicizing his former evil, it would seem that Hans has a better ending than most would think. Director Quentin Tarantino has stated in an interview that he envisioned Hans getting the accolade of a war hero that he bargained for and settled down in Nantucket Island, spending his subsequent years as a detective. But regardless of his fate, I think we can all agree that Hans Landa was an exceptional villain, one masterfully played by Christoph Waltz. And since then, the role has inspired several villains for the same actor along a similar vein, but none of which have come close to the captivating effect of the cruel and charismatic colonel.